Welcome to Unspoken Affairs. Sometimes the most ordinary summer afternoons can hold the weight of unspoken emotions, transforming the air into something unforgettable. The heat of midsummer pressed down upon the house like a heavy blanket, clinging to every surface and filling the rooms with a languid stillness. Sunlight filtered through the curtains in hazy beams, and though every fan hummed at full strength, the air refused to move. It was one of those afternoons where silence felt louder than words, when even the smallest sound carried an echo through the air, as if the walls themselves were listening. Returning home from university for the break, Emily expected nothing more than a quiet weekend. She had spent months buried in deadlines, lectures, and assignments. Her mind constantly in motion, her body exhausted from the relentless pace. Coming home felt like an escape, a chance to recharge and retreat into the familiarity of her mother's house. Her mother, Laura, had gone to visit her sister for a few days, leaving Emily alone with David, Laura's longtime boyfriend. At first, it felt refreshing. Emily and David had always shared a gentle bond. He wasn't her father, but over the years, his presence in her life had grown steady, grounding, and comforting. He was thoughtful, steady, and possessed a subtle humor that could coax a smile from her, even in her darker moods. Their conversations, though often simple, had always carried an ease to them. With busy schedules pulling them in different directions, this unexpected pocket of time together seemed almost like a gift. Meals were shared at the dining table, quiet rhythm of forks against plates, glasses clinking softly, and the rise and fall of casual conversation. Thing drifted easily between topics of school, work, and the endless little details of home life. On the surface, everything seemed ordinary, as though this time together was nothing more than the natural flow of family. Yet beneath the comfort, there lingered a current Emily could not quite name, a pulse beneath the ordinary, something unspoken, that left her both curious and uneasy. As the afternoon deepened, David's demeanor shifted in ways she was not accustomed to. He laughed more freely, spoke with a lightness that seemed unusual, and carried a kind of energy that made the air around him feel different. It was disarming, but not unwelcome, as if some long-forgotten part of him had resurfaced. When he suddenly suggested watching a film, Emily accepted without hesitation. She thought it might be a classic comedy or an old adventure story, something safe. But he smiled with a glimmer in his eyes and proposed something different. Something tender and dramatic. They settled on an old romance, one of those films heavy, with silences, with lingering looks and undercurrents of feeling that ran deeper than the words spoken. At first, Emily allowed herself to sink into the rhythm of the story, following its ebb and flow, losing herself in the hazy glow of the screen. But as the minutes passed, she began to notice the subtleties of their own shared silence. The way David's gaze flickered toward her during certain scenes, not with words, but with something unspoken. The realization made her heart quicken. She forced herself to focus on the screen, to laugh at the right moments, to sit still. Though she was increasingly aware of the space between them, it was fragile, taut like a thread stretched too thin. She told herself she was imagining it, that the atmosphere was nothing more than the effect of the film's heavy mood. But deep down she knew something had shifted, even if neither of them dared to acknowledge it. It was then that a sudden knock at the door broke the spell. Both startled, they glanced at one another before David gestured for Emily to stay put. Curiosity pulled her to the window, where she glimpsed their neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn, standing with a basket in her arms. Relief washed over her as she opened the door to warm greetings and the gift of freshly baked cookies. David joined them with cheer in his voice, thanking their neighbor for her kindness. The short exchange was perfectly ordinary. Yet when Evelyn departed and the door closed again, the stillness inside felt entirely different, as though the walls had absorbed the interruption and left the air charged. They returned to the couch, and David's voice softened as he posed a question that lingered between them like a shadow. What would it be like if it were just the two of them? Emily turned to him, her breath caught in surprise, unable to understand the intent behind his words. His eyes searched hers, carrying a mix of vulnerability and confusion, as though even he wasn't certain why he had said it aloud. The moment seemed to swell with unspoken meaning, her heart racing with questions she couldn't yet form, but before she could respond, her phone buzzed in her hand. It was a message from her mother. Plans had changed. Laura was returning home earlier than expected. Emily showed the text to David, and instantly the spell broke. His expression shifted back to composure, his voice steady as he reminded her that they must act as though everything were normal. She nodded, though the echo of his words lingered in her chest long after. When Laura stepped through the front door hours later, radiant and full of stories from her trip, the scene appeared as serene as any other summer homecoming. Emily and David smiled, exchanged light-hearted remarks, and played their roles well. Yet beneath the surface, nothing felt untouched. That afternoon had planted something unseen but undeniable. Later, as Emily lay awake in her bed staring at the ceiling, she replayed the silences, the words, and the questions that had been left suspended in the air. The summer heat pressed in from the outside. But what weighed most heavily was the sense that life had shifted course in ways she could not yet define. The first day of summer break was supposed to be unremarkable. Instead, it marked the beginning of a subtle transformation. Of bonds tested, of questions unanswered, and of a tension that would not easily be erased. The following days unfolded beneath the same summer haze, though nothing felt the same for Emily. The return of her mother brought back the rhythm of family life. The house rang with laughter, shared meals, and casual stories. Yet every interaction carried a shadow for Emily and David. What had been said and left unsaid lingered like a melody that would not stop echoing in the mind. Laura seemed blissfully unaware of anything unusual. She resumed her usual patterns, busy with plans, filling the home with her energy and affection. She asked Emily about her classes, teased David about his tendency to leave newspapers on the couch, and talked about dinners she wanted to cook to anyone else. It was a scene of normalcy. But for Emily, each word and gesture seemed almost rehearsed. She went along smiling at the right times, laughing when expected, but inside she felt like an actress trapped within a play. David, too, carried himself with composure. His tone was steady, his presence calm, his affection toward Laura tender and consistent. Yet for Emily, there was always something beneath the surface, something that revealed itself in fleeting moments. A glance too long, a silence too heavy, a hesitation when their paths crossed in the hallway. These details, so subtle they might pass unnoticed by others, felt enormous to Emily. Each one made her heart race. Each one reminded her of the conversation that had already changed the atmosphere between them. One evening, they gathered in the living room to watch television together. A light-hearted comedy filled the space with easy laughter, and Laura relaxed comfortably on the couch. Emily curled up on one end, David sat on the other. It should have been simple, ordinary. But when the laughter faded and the room grew quieter, Emily felt David's gaze brush across her. Their eyes met briefly, just a flicker, but enough to make her pulse stumble. There was recognition in his expression, layered with something she dared not name. She looked away quickly, pretending to focus on the screen. Though the moment remained lodged in her chest, later that night, when the house had fallen into silence and Laura was already asleep, Emily wandered back into the living room. The heat of the day had settled into a heavy stillness, and she thought perhaps the cooler air might help clear her mind. To her surprise, David was still there, sitting with a glass in his hand, lost in thought. His posture was weary, his eyes distant, as if wrestling with invisible questions. Emily paused at the doorway, unsure whether to retreat or to step forward. Finally, she crossed the room and sat across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. the silence stretching between them until David finally broke it. His voice was quiet, tinged with regret. He brought up the moment from days before, admitting that it had been a mistake to speak so freely. Emily's throat tightened at his words. She could have agreed, could have brushed it aside, but instead she found herself asking if it truly had been a mistake. The question hung in the air, daring and vulnerable. David looked at her with an intensity she had never seen before. Slowly, he admitted that it had felt real, that something had shifted. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy, charged with a storm that had not yet broken. Emily's heart pounded. There were so many questions within her, so many things she wanted to ask, yet her thoughts tangled into silence, for anything else could unfold. Her phone buzzed on the table. The sound startled her, breaking the fragile moment. A friend had sent a message, an invitation to step away from the house. Emily hesitated, torn between the pull of staying and the need for space. At last she stood, her voice soft but firm as she said she would go out for a while. David's expression was unreadable as he told her to be safe. Emily left, her footsteps quick, her mind racing with contradictions. She did not know if she was fleeing from what was building between them or from herself. When she returned later, the house was dim and quiet. David was still in the living room, this time with a book in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his expression calm but layered with something deeper. Their brief exchange of words was ordinary. Yet beneath it, Emily sensed the weight of everything left unsaid. The days that followed settled into a delicate pattern. On the surface, life returned to normal routines with family meals, conversations, and shared laughter. Yet within those rhythms, Emily felt the edges of something unspoken pressing ever closer. She and David had crossed into a realm of silent acknowledgement. They no longer needed to say anything aloud, for the truth was already there, residing in their glances, in the pauses of conversation, in the way their hearts seemed to quicken in sync. It was a fragile balance impossible to ignore. And Emily knew it was only the beginning of something that could not remain hidden forever. The summer days stretched on, heavy with warmth and silence. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythms of the household, a quiet storm brewed. Emily carried herself with the ease expected of someone returning home. But within her, every glance and every breath held the memory of unspoken words. David, too, moved through the house with practiced calm, but Emily saw the flicker in his eyes that betrayed a deeper unrest. The world around them seemed unchanged. But both knew something delicate and dangerous lingered just beneath the surface. Laura remained blissfully unaware. She filled the home with chatter and warmth, bustling through her routines, planning meals, making phone calls, and sharing stories from her visit with her sister. Emily responded with polite laughter, offered small details about her classes, and played her part convincingly. To any observer, the family appeared perfectly ordinary. But to Emily, each interaction felt staged, as if she were performing a role she could not escape. The tension grew most noticeable in the quiet spaces. Moments between conversations, pauses at the dinner table, or when footsteps echoed down the hallway. When Emily and David passed each other, their eyes would meet fleetingly, carrying the weight of what neither dared to voice. Each brush of hands when reaching for the same dish, each silence that lingered too long wove a thread tighter. Between them, the thread was invisible, yet Emily felt its pull every moment. One evening, Laura suggested a family board game after dinner. Emily joined reluctantly, but the laughter of her mother filled the room with a brightness that almost masked the undercurrent. David smiled more than usual, leaning into the light-hearted atmosphere. Yet whenever Emily's hand touched his in the scramble for a card, her heart jolted. His eyes, though softened by the glow of the lamp, carried an awareness that mirrored her own. The game ended with Laura triumphant, her laughter spilling into the night. But for Emily, the joy was only on the surface. Later, when the house grew quiet again, Emily stepped into the living room, She found David there once more, his glass half empty, his eyes distant. He looked up at her with a weary smile, one that seemed to hold too much meaning. She settled at the far end of the couch, tucking her legs beneath her. And for a moment they simply sat in silence. It was no longer awkward. It had become familiar, a language without words. When Emily spoke, her voice was low and uncertain. She told him he had been different lately. David paused, then admitted she had changed too. Their words circled around the truth, never touching it directly, but leaving no doubt that both felt it pressing closer. David confessed he could not stop thinking about the other night, about what had been said and left unsaid. Emily's heart tightened at his honesty, for she felt the same. The air between them seemed charged, as if the walls themselves had drawn closer to listen. Before the moment could swell into something more, Emily's phone buzzed. She grabbed it quickly, relief and frustration mingling within her. It was a message from Aunt Claire, announcing she was arriving earlier than expected. Shock washed over Emily as she showed the message to David. His face paled and he whispered disbelief. Moments later, a knock echoed at the door. When they opened it, there stood Claire, vibrant and cheerful, suitcase in hand. She swept into the house with energy, filling the rooms with chatter about her change of plans. Emily forced a smile, though inside she felt trapped. Claire's presence became an unplanned barrier, her constant stories and laughter smothering the fragile silence that had begun to define Emily's world. David played the role of gracious host, okay, but his glances revealed the turmoil beneath. As the night wore on, Emily felt the weight of the change. The delicate thread between her and David had not disappeared, but now it was buried beneath the noise of Claire's presence. Even so, when their eyes met across the dinner table, she felt the same spark, the same silent acknowledgement. It was undeniable, and it grew heavier with every passing day. The household was alive with family cheer. But for Emily, each smile and each laugh was layered with tension. The secret thread was tightening, and she knew it would not hold forever. Days turned into a balancing act. Claire lingered longer than anyone had expected, and her presence forced Emily and David into careful restraint. Every word, every glance had to be measured, hidden behind a veil of normalcy. Yet in the spaces between, in the quietest of moments, their unspoken truth remained. It was a truth that neither time nor distraction could erase. And Emily understood that what had begun could not be easily contained. The days that followed became a delicate balancing act, with every hour demanding more careful restraint. Aunt Claire had settled comfortably into the household, her presence loud and constant. She brought stories from her work, anecdotes about her friends, and endless comments about her travels. The house, once wrapped in uneasy silence, now hummed with chatter and activity. Yet for Emily and David, the new noise did not erase the truth that lingered quietly beneath the surface. Instead, it forced them to bury it deeper, to perfect their performance of normalcy. Laura seemed delighted by Claire's unexpected stay. The two sisters filled the kitchen with laughter, cooked together, and often spent long evenings sharing wine and conversation. For Emily, their joy was both comforting and suffocating. She wanted to join, to lean into the warmth of family, but she could not escape the undercurrent of something else, something that tied her more tightly to David with each passing glance. Even in the busiest rooms, she could sense his awareness of her. And when their eyes met across the table, she felt the silent weight of all they dared not say. Every shared moment between Emily and David became charged. A brush of hands, while passing dishes, a pause too long when their gazes collided. Even the faintest smile carried more meaning than words could hold. These gestures, invisible to others, formed a language known only to the two of them. It was a language that grew heavier with every exchange. The presence of Claire and Laura was both shield and prison, protecting them from crossing boundaries, yet imprisoning them in silence that grew increasingly unbearable. One afternoon, while Laura and Claire went shopping, Emily found David alone in the kitchen, reading the newspaper. The late light of day poured in, catching in his hair, and for a long moment Emily stood in the doorway, uncertain. Finally, she stepped forward, her voice quiet but steady as she told him they needed to talk. He looked up, setting the paper aside, and in his eyes she saw the same conflict reflected. They spoke in hushed tones, circling the truth they had both carried in silence. Emily admitted she could not stop thinking about what had been said before, about the feelings that seemed impossible to deny. David's reply was just as honest. He confessed that he thought of it too, that he felt the same pull. Their words filled the space like fragile glass, shimmering with danger and honesty. Emily's heart raced as she asked if perhaps they should confront the truth, even if only to understand what it meant. She suggested something small, a way to know if their emotions were real or merely illusions of a restless summer. The idea hovered in the air between them, reckless yet undeniable. David hesitated, his expression torn, but at last he nodded with a weight that made Emily's breath falter. Before anything more could happen, footsteps sounded in the hall. Claire's cheerful voice broke through, asking if they were all right. Both startled, they pulled apart as if caught in something forbidden. Emily's voice rose slightly too high as she answered that they had only been talking. Claire entered with a smile, oblivious, announcing plans for another family evening. The fragile moment dissolved like smoke, leaving Emily shaken by how close they had come to a truth that could not be undone. That night, after the noise of dinner and laughter had quieted, Emily found herself restless in her room. She could not sleep. Her thoughts churned with the memory of their near confession, of how close they had been to stepping across an invisible line. She wondered if what she felt was real, or if it was